Does that kind of give you a start? It's water. It's basically like a watercolor, but it's not exactly the same, and the tools and the traditions are quite different. Very, very different than oil painting. No similarity there at all.
The question about the mandate of heaven, it seems that that would be seminal to all of this ceremonial art. What is the myth of the mandate of heaven? I mean, it's
so the base religion in China, and it's something that when people often talking about Chinese art and Chinese religion don't look at. But starting at the very beginning, really in the Shang Dynasty, the oracle bones, this kind of need to communicate with a higher being. Shangdi was what it was during the Bronze Age or during the Shang Dynasty, but it became heaven. And heaven's a rather amorphous, ill-defined, but heaven controls everything through powers of qi, yin and yang, and the five symbols. It really develops quite early on. As by the time you get to the Han Dynasty, this idea of the mandate of heaven and the kind of state cult is very well developed, and it is a religion. So these ceremonies were religious practices. They were done as a religion, making sacrifices to the ancestors who communicated to heaven, making sacrifices to heaven directly, and showing that the emperor deserved the mandate of heaven. From very, very early times, heaven was meant to send messages, portents, and omens. So if there was an eclipse, that was to be interpreted by those bureaucrats, the court bureaucrats, that there was an omen, that heaven was saying something. The sun's getting blotted out, that's something. That's a bad message. So as you read through the court records of China from the very earliest times all the way up until the end of the Qing, there's these records of all these kinds of things. It's actually possible to go through the court records of the Six Dynasties period and track eclipses and when they happened very, very precisely from those kinds of the reports of these omens' importance. It's a very well-established and very structured religion. So it's there's Taoism, there's Confucianism, there's Buddhism, but there's also the state cult, and that's a very important part of all Chinese religious practices. Does that kind of help a little bit? Okay.
You noted in the picture of the 9 emperors that the emperor himself diminishes as you go along. Was this done deliberately by the artists? And if so, how did they dare, given that the emperor wasn't going to like that and would,
I guess
be rather wrathful?
I guess since the early ones were done by early artists and late ones were done by late artists, I guess this is how the emperor expected to be seen. And for me to make that kind of flip psychological an analysis of those paintings, maybe a little flip, but boy, when I look at it, those early guys, they were big and portly, and they had something to prove, and they were military men and men of power and dynamism. And those late guys, they were just basically buried under this. And I think they must have felt that way. I think that's how they wanted to be. That's how they were, and that must have been how they felt and how they wanted to be portrayed. These are their official portraits. Whether they actually look like this or not is hard to say, but these are their official portraits. And boy, as you go through the Ming and you read about the increasing weight of all the burdens of all the things that they had to do, the Wanli Emperor basically just ran away and hid. Wouldn't do it. He didn't show up in court for however many years, 15 years or something like that. So they were really overwhelmed by the burden of all of this, trying to prove they had the mandate. But actually, these are anonymous artisans, and you're right. If they had done something that displeased the emperor, it would have been very, very painful, I think.
One of the things that we are most proud of here at the University of San Francisco is that the Jesuits arrived about this time in China, in the Middle Kingdom. And they came particularly with a science point of view. And they helped build some of the most beautiful instruments you'll ever see. They're on a tower in downtown Beijing. They're called both the Ming and the Qing Dynasty astronomical instruments. They're very large, they're cast in bronze, they're quite beautiful, but they were actually used. And in the mandate of heaven, you were, if you could have very smart people working with you, like we hope the Jesuits certainly were, that you could predict things like an eclipse. And if you predicted it, you really had the mandate coming because you knew it's going to come, and it does come, and it proves again you're the smartest woman in town. Hi, how are you? Here's your microphone.
You made references to factories and mass production, and so where I, as a viewer, I can't make the distinction as to what is everyday utilitarian household wares, and when did they actually slow down to produce a masterpiece so that they could show off their artistry and technology? Because I can't seem to sort it out as what is produced for for household, and what is a real masterpiece according to them. Like, let's say the vases, like if you show us that vase again, the one from the beginning, was that for everyday use, or was that to really show off how masterful they were?
So all the pieces that I've shown today, that I've selected to show today, were meant for, they have imperial marks. So they were made at the imperial workshops and were meant for imperial consumption, either in this, this kind of elaborate ritual structure, or the day-to-day use of the imperial family. There were lots of materials being produced at Jingdezhen for private use throughout China, but also for export. And if you're ever at the museum and look, it's really easy to tell the difference. You put a piece like that up against a piece made at the same time for domestic use, and there's no comparison. The level of scale, the purity of the ceramic, the purity of the decoration, the quality of the decoration. The material that was being sent to Europe that the Europeans were going crazy over was dreck. That was kind of stuff that was done as, was just, we're going to make some money here, we're going to get this stuff out of here. This stuff was really, really carefully done by people who were highly trained, using the most advanced technologies of the time, and a very elaborate and very systematic industrial system. So there's a real range of ceramics being made at the same time. Often they carry the same kind of motifs. They may have fish and such. But if you look at them, if you actually can handle the real thing, there are huge differences in levels of quality.
You can tell that if you come to my house, because for years now I've been going to China, and I go out into the countryside right after Mr. Nixon was there, and I say to little old lady, you want to give me that vase, I give you like $25, and she has nothing but some granules of rice in it, etc., and she sees $25, and immediately I own the vase. So I've been dragging these blue and white vases from Qing Dynasty after 1850 so that they're marked that they're legal to take out. But whenever I show them to my friends who know something, they say, these are not museum quality at all. These are just pieces you collected out in the villages. And now there's a friend of mine in the back who wants to ask a question.
You mentioned before that textiles were made in Mexico under the supervision of the Chinese, and I'd like to find out what type. And the second thing is kasu. Where did it originate? The very fine tapestry weavings, and what's the earliest example of that? And my third question is, what woods were used in their furniture? You showed examples of lacquer and household furniture. And
Okay, so there are 3 very, very long lectures. So in the Cambridge History of China, if you read the version, the volume that's on the later part of the Ming, and Raymond, forgetting his name, has done a very thorough study of the silk industry. And he interviewed and did work with historians in Mexico. And his interest was in what was going on economically in Zhejiang province. So he was doing studies in particular areas in Zhejiang province where the families that were growing silk did it, most of the time silk was done as a sideline. So they were still growing the crops that they ate, and they were growing other kinds of support crops, and silk was done as a sideline, and the women were picking the silk and maintaining the mulberry trees and taking care of the silkworms and such. But it was a sideline. But in around 1600, it became an industry where that's all these people were doing. They were raising silk. And they were raising silk both for production within China, but also as a raw material that was sent to Mexico. And there was a lot of trade going back and forth between China and Mexico. All that silver coming in, well, what was the Chinese sending out? They were sending out ceramics and textiles, both in the raw form and the finished form. Kasu slit tapestry, there's still a very active debate. The Chinese would tell you that it was something that developed in China. It probably came in from Central Asia and probably came in somewhere towards the end of the Tang Dynasty, so around the 10th century, the beginning of the 10th century, into China. It was being done in other places earlier than that. And I would get a lot of debate from certain textile experts in China if they were to hear me say that. There's a very, very great textile museum in Hangzhou, the National Textile Museum in Hangzhou. And if you're really interested, they have the looms, it's marvelous. And that gives you a pretty good idea of how the textile industry worked. Those looms were big, and they took multiple people to run them. The woods, there's a long story with the woods. For various reasons, China closed its borders in the 1430s. So a lot of the woods was domestic hardwoods, that is domestic woods that are deciduous trees, elm and so on. And a lot of those were covered with lacquer, and that's the base wood for lacquer. Some softwoods, but mostly the hardwoods, mostly deciduous trees. Those import restrictions went away in the 1560s in the reign of the Longqing Emperor, and tropical hardwoods were imported. So a lot of the so-called rosewood furniture, the hardwood furniture that we see from the later part of the Ming and the Qing, those are woods that were imported from Southeast Asia, Hainan Island. A friend of mine who's a wood specialist suspects that some of it actually came from the Americas. Again, in that ongoing trade back and forth, rosewoods coming from Honduras, Belize, that kind of area. Still great rosewoods there, those kinds of pterocarpus, the different kinds of rosewoods. So again, those are woods that were imported. They were imported tropical hardwoods. And there's you'd have to look at different examples. We'd have to go through what Huanghuali is, what Sitan is, what Jiqimu is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a long and complicated story. Did that kind of answer your questions a little bit? Okay.
Now I want to tell you something that has nothing to do with China. On the 27th of March, a Nobel Prize winner in physics is coming here. He's at Stanford. He's gotten very tired of people talking about global warming and climate change. So he's coming here to tell you what it is that they do know in science and what they don't know. He's on neither side, nor is he politically oriented to either party. He is a fantastic writer. He has a wonderful short book called Beyond